In 1937, an archivist cataloging plantation records in Alabama found a photograph that should not exist. It showed a woman, immense, ghostly pale, sitting in an iron chair beside a small, malformed man in torn suspenders. Behind them, a third figure, a tall, elegant man, had been scratched out entirely. The caption beneath read only, "Easter of our bargain, 1852. No record of that plantation, or the people in that photograph, was ever found again. But in the months that followed, the archivist who found it began writing letters, strange, feverish letters, claiming to hear breathing behind the walls. 3 weeks later, she vanished. The photograph was locked away by the State Historical Society. The name of the plantation erased from all surviving maps. And yet, if you travel deep enough into Clarke County, locals still whisper of a house whose windows exhale at night. They call it the House of the Bargain. Bellmare Plantation was said to stand near the Tombigbee River, thick, humid land where even the cypress trees grew warped and swollen. Owned by Judge Horace L. Bellmare, a cotton magnate and former circuit judge, the estate had once been known for its vast wealth and its silence. No slave songs, no laughter, just the mechanical hum of the loom house and the occasional sound of someone crying in the sugar fields. Horace Bellmare had a wife, Eleanor, famed across Alabama for her size and her voice. She was said to weigh near 300 pounds and sing hymns that made men weep. But after 1849, Eleanor stopped singing. That same year, Judge Bellmare purchased a slave known only as Samuel the Dwarf, a man barely 4 feet tall with a twisted spine and black eyes that reflected candlelight like glass. Rumor held that Samuel was no ordinary man, that he was brought not from Africa, but from a traveling freak show that vanished in Mobile under mysterious circumstances. Locals swore that after Samuel's arrival, the plantation grew colder, the wells soured, the cotton failed, and the judge began locking the chapel every Sunday. In 1852, when the Church of St. Adeline came to investigate moral irregularities at Bellmare, they found the judge unrepentant. He claimed he had made a covenant, a test of flesh and obedience. Records from that hearing were burned in the courthouse fire of 1863, but fragments survive. He gave his own wife to the dwarf to breed humility. He called it his tithe to the Lord of Measure. The townsfolk believed he'd gone mad. But among the enslaved, a different story spread. They said the judge's fields were haunted by a shadow that moved under the soil, something that drank sweat and whispers, something that counted every sin. Every night, the judge would lead Eleanor by a chain into the old nursery where Samuel waited. And each morning, the walls would drip. Bellmare's mansion was unlike others of its time. No grand staircase, no portraits, no children's laughter. Instead, its central hall was dominated by a series of mirrors. Each was slightly warped, like water frozen mid-motion. Visitors described feeling taller, thinner, or heavier depending on where they stood. Eleanor was forbidden from entering the parlor after sundown, but servants said they'd seen her reflection moving even when she stood perfectly still. When the judge entertained guests, he insisted they toast before those mirrors. He called it a reckoning of forms. Later, when bodies began to disappear, first a field hand, then the midwife, then the judge's own nephew, no one could agree on what was real anymore. Because by then, even the mirrors were beginning to change. Eleanor's screams filled the fields one August morning in 1853. She gave birth in the attic, attended only by Samuel and an old slave woman named Ruth. When Ruth ran from the house, bleeding, hysterical, she told others that the baby was born without a face. The judge declared the infant stillborn and ordered it buried beneath the sycamore grove. But that night, several workers swore they heard something crying underground, and the next morning, the sycamores had grown 3 feet taller. One by one, people who worked at Bellmare vanished. Those who tried to leave said they couldn't find the road back to town. The forest seemed to twist and reform behind them. By October, no one but the judge, Eleanor, and Samuel remained. Travelers passing by reported seeing lights in the upper windows, shapes moving between curtains, and, once, the unmistakable sound of a baby laughing, though the plantation had been abandoned for weeks. Locals said the judge had finally paid his debt, but no one knew to whom to. In November 1853, Reverend Jonathan Creer of the local parish rode to Bellmare. He claimed the bishop had sent him to restore order to the Lord's house. When he arrived, the mansion was quiet. The doors hung open. The parlor mirrors were all covered with sheets, except one. The Reverend described it later in a single, trembling sentence. The reflection was wrong. In his written account, now lost but paraphrased in his sermons, he said that in the mirror he saw not himself, but a room full of people watching him. They were smiling. None of them had eyes. He left Bellmare that night and burned his own vestments. 2 weeks later, his church bell began ringing on its own. He was found dead at the altar, his hands folded in prayer, his reflection still moving behind him in the stained glass. By 1854, every public record connected to Judge Bellmare was erased or missing. Deeds, baptism certificates, court orders, gone. A courthouse clerk named Lydia March tried to reconstruct the archives and was dismissed for unwholesome conduct. In her surviving diary, she wrote, "Every time I write his name, I feel a pressure behind my skull, like someone's hand pushing from the inside." She also noted that the judge's signature contained a curious mark, a sigil shaped like a coiled measuring tape. Its Latin inscription read, Deus mediter omnia. God measures all things. According to plantation folklore, the ritual of measure was performed once a year at Bellmare, on Easter night. The judge would seat his wife, Eleanor, before the mirror in the great hall. Samuel would stand beside her holding a silver ruler. They would measure her arms, her legs, her waist, her breath. Each number recorded in a black ledger. The judge believed that by weighing flesh, he could quantify sin, reduce the soul to a balance sheet. But Eleanor's numbers never stayed the same. They grew larger each year, as if something inside her was expanding, consuming, becoming more than human. By the final ritual, she filled the entire chair. And the chair began to breathe. On April 10, 1854, lightning struck the sycamore grove. Witnesses from a nearby farm said they saw fire climb downward, not up. The next morning, Bellmare Mansion was gone, collapsed into its own cellar, leaving only fragments of brick and a single, half-melted mirror. The local sheriff declared it an accident, but the report was unsigned. A month later, the sheriff's family disappeared. Only a warped silver ruler was found on his desk, marked in units that no one could read. For decades, the land remained untouched. Locals avoided it. Cattle refused to graze near it, and children who wandered too close came home talking about the short man who lived in the trees. By 1890, the plantation had faded into rumor, reduced to a local ghost story. But certain families, descendants of those who once served Bellmare, still left offerings at the site: bread, salt, and sewing needles. They called it feeding the measure. In 1901, a Catholic orphanage was built over the ruins. It was named after the same church that had once condemned Bellmare. For 10 years, the children there drew the same picture: a woman in a chair, a dwarf with black eyes, and a baby under the floor. Teachers dismissed it as imagination, until the walls began to crack. When workers repaired the foundation, they found dozens of bones beneath the old stone, but none were fully human. In 1922, a historian named Dr. Marion Kell surveyed the property for the Alabama Historical Society. She uncovered 3 charred ledgers inside a sealed crate labeled Bellmare, private. 2 were empty. The third contained only measurements, long columns of numbers beside names. At the bottom of the final page, E. Bellmare, 502 pounds. Still increasing. Dr. Kell stopped her research the next week. She told her assistant, "The ledger knows my weight now." 3 days later, she drowned in her bathtub. Her body, witnesses said, was heavier than it should have been. In 1937, an archivist named Ruth Keller found a metal canister labeled simply Easter. Inside was the photograph, the one of the fat woman and the dwarf, and a short reel of film. It depicted the parlor, lit by candles. In the mirror's reflection, dozens of people stood watching, though only 3 were in the room. At the end of the reel, a title card flickered into view. The weight of sin must be shared. The film melted in the projector during viewing. The archivist disappeared that night. In 1941, when surveyors visited Clarke County to build a new road, they noted that the land had begun sinking again. The soil was soft and pulsed underfoot. New sycamores had grown where the mansion once stood, tall, white, their roots shaped like limbs. At night, travelers swore they saw lights moving inside the trunks. One foreman claimed to hear someone whisper, "Measure me." He quit the next morning, leaving all his equipment behind. By 1943, Clarke County's birth registries showed gaps, entire families listed with no recorded deaths. Locals began to suspect an illness, but no bodies were buried. Instead, townspeople complained of night heaviness, waking with blood in their noses and weight on their chests. Old-timers said the Bellmare house was reforming, room by room, breath by breath. A journal surfaced in 1946, supposedly written by Samuel himself. Its pages were stained with oil and blood. He wrote of his life before the plantation, sold to freak shows, then to the judge. But one passage was different. He promised me freedom if I could make her smaller. But she would not yield. She fed on what I took from her. She fed on me. At the end, Samuel described burying the faceless child and hearing it whisper beneath the dirt. Not yet measured. No one knows who found the journal or where it went. In 1951, a mirror labeled Origin Unknown, Clarke County, ca. 1850, was placed on display at the Mobile Historical Museum. Visitors reported feeling dizzy when standing before it. Some claimed their reflections looked swollen or hunched. The museum removed it after 3 guards quit, each citing nightmares of counting limbs. When they checked the storeroom weeks later, the mirror was gone. All that remained was a silver ruler, warped into a circle. In the summer of 1954, a group of geology students camped near the old plantation site. Their audio recordings, recovered decades later, contain an unexplained humming beneath the soil. On the 4th night, one student asked, laughing, "What's the weight of the world, Eleanor?" A woman's voice replied, still increasing. The tape ends with heavy breathing and the sound of something wet moving closer to the microphone. No bodies were ever found. Fade in, somber music, archival film grain, voice trembling with dread. Narrator: they say the land remembers its bargains, that some pacts were not written in blood, but in mass, and that when the scales are unbalanced, the world begins to sag, inch by inch, beneath the weight of its own deceit. Somewhere, beneath the roots of Clarke County, a woman still sits in her chair. She has no face. She hums a hymn that sounds like breathing, and beside her stands a man no taller than your shoulder, holding a ruler that measures in size. When the night grows quiet, listen closely, because the earth beneath you, it's still measuring. Static. Fade to black.